The frost wasn't just under his boots, it was inside him. A deep, marrow-numbing cold that had settled 3 months ago and refused to thaw. The wind off the Nevada desert sliced through his thin jacket, carrying the scent of sagebrush, dust, and something else. The faint, ghostly tang of hay from the empty stable behind him, empty except for the memories that hung like cobwebs in every shadowed corner. What do you do when the only thing left of someone you loved is a responsibility they left behind? A responsibility with 4 legs, terrified eyes, and a will to vanish into the wild? Elias didn't look at the stable. He stared out past the sagging fence towards the vast moon-washed emptiness where the mountains bit into the star-scattered sky. 500 kilometers. 500 kilometers driven through the night, fueled by cheap gas station coffee and a promise whispered to a photograph. A promise he wasn't sure he could keep. The silence here wasn't peaceful. It was accusatory. It pressed down, heavy as the grief he carried like a stone in his chest. He jammed his hands deeper into his pockets, fingertips numb. The key to the borrowed stock trailer felt cold and alien in his palm. He didn't need to turn around to know she was there. He could feel it, a shift in the air, a tension humming just beyond the weak pool of light cast by the single bulb above. The stable door. He'd seen her only once before, weeks ago, in a grainy photo sent by a frantic BLM ranger. A tiny, ragged silhouette against the setting sun, impossibly alone. Mustang filly, orphaned, won't let anyone near, starving. The words had echoed the hollowness inside him. Slowly, forcing his breathing to stay even, Elias turned. The frost crunched loudly under his heel. She flinched, a ripple of pure panic moving through her lean frame like a shudder. Moonlight silvered the sharp angles of her ribs, the hollows above her eyes. She stood frozen just beyond the circle of light, a phantom sculpted from dust and desperation. Her coat, a dull, tangled roan, blended with the scrub and shadows. But her eyes. Even from 20 feet away he saw them. Huge, dark, liquid pools reflecting the cold moon and an ancient, bottomless fear. One ear was torn, a ragged notch near the tip. She didn't make a sound, just stood, trembling minutely, every muscle coiled tight as a spring, ready to explode into flight. Elias didn't move towards her. He didn't call out soothing nonsense. He knew better. He remembered the stories his grandfather told about the wild ones, the ones whose spirit hadn't been broken. This one. Her spirit was all she had left. It was etched in the defiant angle of her head, the way her nostrils flared wide, drinking in his scent, judging his threat. He lowered himself slowly, deliberately, until he was sitting on the icy ground, his back against the rough wood of the fence post. He made himself smaller, less imposing. He pulled his knees up, wrapped his arms around them and looked down at his worn boots, not at her. The wind whistled through the barbed wire. A coyote yipped, far away. The silence stretched, thin and brittle. He waited. Minutes bled into an hour. The cold seeped through his jeans, gnawing at his bones. His legs cramped. He shifted slightly, wincing. Her head snapped up, a sharp intake of breath. He froze. Held, himself perfectly still. His breath plumed white in the frigid air. He focused on the sound of his own heartbeat, a slow, steady drum against the vast quiet. He thought of the long drive, the empty passenger seat, the silence in the cab that had screamed. He thought of the promise. I'll find her, Sarah. I'll bring her home. Home. This empty ranch felt like anything but. A rustle. Dry grass, whispering against thin legs. He didn't look up. Not yet. He kept his gaze lowered, his posture relaxed, non-threatening. The sound came again, closer. Hesitant. He could hear her breathing now, quick and shallow. Smell the wild scent of her, dust, dry sweat, fear. He felt the intensity of her gaze like a physical pressure on the top of his head. She was circling wide, keeping her distance, assessing him from every angle. A predator assessing prey, or prey assessing a predator. He wasn't sure which he was anymore. Another eternity passed. The moon climbed higher, bleaching the color from the world. His fingers were numb blocks. He risked a tiny movement, slowly uncurling one hand from around his knee, letting it rest palm up on the frozen earth beside him. Empty, offering nothing, demanding nothing. A gesture as old as the hills themselves. He closed his eyes. Let the exhaustion wash over him. The grief, the miles, the cold. It was a crushing weight. Then, a warmth. A soft, hesitant puff of air against his knuckles. His eyes flew open. She was there, less than 3 feet away. Her head stretched out, neck elongated, ears swiveling nervously. Her nostrils flared inches from his hand, blowing warm, moist breath onto his frozen skin. Her dark eyes were huge, locked on his face, searching. He didn't move a muscle, didn't dare breathe. Her muzzle, soft as worn velvet, brushed the back of his knuckles. Once, twice, testing. Her whiskers tickled. He could see the fine white scar above her left eye, the dust caked in her forelock. He could smell the sweetness of her breath now mixed with the wildness. Slowly, incredibly, she lowered her head. Not resting it, not trusting that far. But she brought it down, hovering near his open hand, her neck curved. Her breathing still. Rapid seemed to lose its frantic edge, just for a moment. She stood there, this fragile ghost of the desert, this orphaned scrap of untamed spirit suspended in the moonlight, mere inches from his hand, from him. Elias felt a crack somewhere deep inside, a fissure in the ice that had encased him. Not warmth, not yet, but a startling absence of the crushing cold, a space where something else might eventually grow. He didn't know her name. He didn't know the depth of her wounds, physical or otherwise. He didn't know if he could ever coax her into the waiting trailer, let alone build a life for her in the echoing silence of Sarah's ranch. But in that suspended moment, under the indifferent stars, a fragile thread had spun itself between them. A thread spun from moonlight, frost, and shared unspoken desolation. He stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, watching the delicate flare of her nostrils, the tremor still running through her thin shoulders. He knew the slightest wrong move. A cough, a sudden sound, could shatter this impossible proximity. She was poised on a knife edge. He was the anchor, however tentative. The wind sighed through the sagebrush again, a lonely sound. The coyote called once more, closer this time. Her ear twitched towards the sound, but her eyes, dark and liquid, remained fixed on him, questioning, waiting. He didn't know why. He didn't understand the impulse that had driven him across the desert in the dead of night. He didn't know how to mend the broken pieces inside himself, let alone inside this wild creature. But when the coyote's cry faded and the vast silence rushed back in, she didn't bolt. She didn't retreat into the protective shadows. She took one infinitesimal step closer, her shoulder almost brushing the fence post beside him. Her breath warmed the side of his neck. She stood, guarding, or merely sharing the cold vigil. Elias closed his eyes again, not against her, but against the sudden confusing sting behind his own lids. The ice was definitely cracking. He knew the dawn would come. He knew the trailer stood waiting, a dark maw of the unknown. He knew the real work. The terrifying work of trust hadn't even begun. But for now, in this frozen desert midnight, they breathed the same air. Two lost souls adrift in a vast, uncaring landscape. The filly shifted her weight, a soft sigh, escaping her. Her head dipped lower, not quite resting, but relaxing just a fraction near his shoulder. The scent of her, wild and vulnerable, filled his senses. He stayed utterly still, the borrowed trailer key a cold, forgotten weight in his pocket. The only thing that mattered was the fragile heat radiating from her thin body beside him, and the terrifying, beautiful uncertainty of what came next. He didn't know why, but when the first pale streaks of dawn finally began to bleed into the eastern sky, painting the desert in shades of cold rose and gray, and he slowly, achingly, pushed himself up from the frozen ground, The filly didn't flee. She watched him stand, her eyes wide but steady. And when he took one hesitant step towards the stable door, intending only to get the halter Sarah had left behind, the filly took one hesitant step and followed. Weeks bled into the rhythm of dawn feedings and dusk watches. Sarah's ranch, once echoing with absence, now held a fragile new pulse. The filly, Elias still couldn't bring himself to name her, as if naming her would make her his, erasing the ghost she carried, occupied the small corral behind the stable. She no longer flinched at every footfall, but her trust was a wary bird, landing briefly only to take flight again at a sudden sound, a shadow that moved wrong. Elias moved with the deliberate slowness of someone navigating a minefield. His grief, that heavy stone, hadn't vanished. It had just shifted, making room for the exhausting vigilance of caring for this wild, wounded creature. He saw Sarah everywhere, in the slant of afternoon light through the dusty stable window, in the worn leather of her old work gloves he now wore, in the stubborn silence that clung to the empty house. The filly was a constant, living reminder, a question mark etched in muscle and bone. Why had Sarah cared so much about this particular wild band? Why this orphan? The ranger's initial call replayed. Saw your sister's truck parked out near Mustang Ridge for weeks before she passed. Always watching that roan mare and her filly. One chill morning, Elias found the filly not pacing her usual circuit near the fence, but utterly still, rigid as stone, her head high, nostrils flared wide. She stared fixedly at the old, weather-beaten tackroom door, left slightly ajar. Her ears were pinned flat back, then flickered wildly forward, a visible tremor running along her neck. Not fear, exactly. Recognition? An intensity Elias hadn't seen before. He followed her gaze. Nothing stirred inside the dimness. Just dust motes dancing in a weak sunbeam. What is it, girl? His voice was rough, unused. She didn't flick an ear towards him. Her entire being was focused on that dark crack of doorway. A prickle, cold and sharp, traced Elias's spine. He pushed the door open wider. The smell of old leather, liniment, and undisturbed dust washed over him. Saddles hung on racks, bridles draped over hooks, all Sarah's, untouched since the last time she'd ridden. He stepped inside, the filly's tension radiating from the corral like an electric field behind him. He wasn't looking for anything, just escaping the weight of her stare. He ran a hand over the smooth seat of Sarah's favorite saddle, the leather worn supple by years of use. Dust coated his fingertips. He turned, scanning the cluttered shelves. Cans of hoof oil, rolls, a vet wrap, a box of worn farrier tools. Then his eyes caught on a flash of color tucked behind a stack of dusty saddle pads on a high shelf. Red. A deep, faded crimson. He reached up, his fingers brushing something soft. He pulled it down. A scarf. Sarah's scarf. The one she always wore knotted around her neck in winter. The one woven with threads of gold and deep red like desert sunset. He remembered buying it for her on a trip to Santa Fe years ago. She'd laughed, calling it ridiculously extravagant, then worn it constantly. He brought it to his face. It smelled faintly of her. Sunshine, sage, and the unique scent that was simply Sarah. Not the sterile hospital smell that haunted his nightmares. This was her. The dam broke. Not a trickle, but a catastrophic collapse. The stone in his chest shattered. A raw, guttural sound tore from his throat, ripped from a place he'd sealed shut. He crumpled, the scarf clutched desperately in his fist, his back hitting the rough wood of the tackroom wall as his legs gave way. Sobs racked him, violent and uncontrollable. 3 months of held-breath grief, of numb functionality, of driving through the night fueled by duty, exploded. He wept for the empty passenger seat, for the silence in the kitchen, for the future they'd planned that now lay in ashes. He wept for the terrifying vulnerability of loving something wild and broken, like the creature outside, like himself. He wept for Sarah. Fiercely, desperately, the scarf pressed against his face, a futile shield against the agony. He was lost in the storm, adrift in a sea of salt and shattered glass. The world narrowed to the rough wood against his back, the smell of leather and dust and the crushing, suffocating weight of absence. Time dissolved. He didn't hear the soft shuffle of hooves on the packed earth outside, didn't register the quiet snort, the hesitant step. Then, warmth. Solid, living warmth pressed against his side. He flinched violently, his tear blurred, vision struggling to focus. She was there. Inside the tack room doorway. The filly. She'd pushed the door wider. She stood beside him, her shoulder pressed firmly against his arm, where he sat slumped against the wall. Her head was lowered, her long neck curved, her breath warm and steady puffed against his temple, stirring his hair. Not demanding, not fearful, just present, solid, anchoring. He froze, mid-sob, breath hitching. She didn't move away. She didn't nuzzle. She simply stood, her warm side a constant pressure against his shaking frame, her head lowered near his shoulder, breathing slowly, deeply. Her dark eye watched him, not with pity, but with a profound, ancient stillness. She waited. As the violent tremor subsided into shuddering breaths, as the raw gasps softened into quiet tears, she remained, a silent, steadfast pillar in the dim light of the tack room filled with ghosts. Her own flanks quivered slightly, but she held her ground. She breathed with him, matching the slowing rhythm of his own ragged inhalations. The scent of her, warm horse, dust, hay, mingled with the scent of the scarf and the old leather, a strange grounding alchemy. She stayed until the last tremor left his hands, until his breathing settled into something resembling calm, until the crushing weight, felt, shared, not gone but bearable. Months later, the Nevada spring arrived, tentative and fierce. Wildflowers painted the scrubland in brief, brilliant explosions of color. The filly's ribs were no longer stark ridges beneath her roan coat. She'd filled out, her movements less frantic, more fluid. A wary curiosity had replaced the constant terror in her eyes. Elias called her Ember now, for the flecks of copper in her dark mane that caught the low sun. The name felt right. A small spark kindled in the ashes. The heaviness in Elias hadn't vanished, but it had changed shape. It was no longer a crushing stone, but a familiar weight he carried, like the calluses on his hands from rebuilding the fence. He could breathe without the constant ache of suffocation. He could look at Sarah's saddle without feeling the floor drop away. He could sit on the porch at dusk and watch Ember graze peacefully in the lengthening shadows without the sharp sting of why cutting quite so deep. One warm afternoon, Ember was unusually restless. Instead of her usual methodical grazing near the stable, she paced the far corner of the corral, her head high, ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring as she tested the wind coming down from the high ridge behind the ranch. She whickered softly, a questioning sound Elias hadn't heard before. He watched her, leaning against the fence post, sipping lukewarm coffee. She looked towards him, then back towards the ridge, pawing the ground lightly with a front hoof. An unmistakable signal. "All right, girl," he murmured, setting his mug down. "Show me." He unlatched the corral gate. Ember didn't bolt. She waited, dancing with impatience, then led the way, not towards the open desert, but along a narrow, overgrown path Elias hadn't walked in years. It wound up behind the stable, through a thicket of juniper and rabbit brush, climbing the lower slope of the ridge. Elias followed, the dry earth crunching under his boots, the scent of sagebrush and warm stone thick in the air. Ember moved with purpose, her strides confident, glancing back occasionally as if to ensure he followed. The path opened into a small, hidden clearing. Sunlight dappled through the branches of a single ancient, gnarled apple tree. Its twisted branches, thick with moss, reached towards the sky. It was past blooming, tiny green apples just beginning to form. Elias stopped, catching his breath. He'd forgotten this place. Sarah had loved it. Called it her thinking spot. He remembered picnics here, years ago. Sarah sitting against the broad trunk, sketching the wildflowers or just watching the hawk circle. Ember walked straight to the base of the tree. She lowered her head, not to graze, but to nudge something half buried in the thick grass and fallen leaves near the roots. Elias stepped closer. It was a small, flat stone. He crouched down, brushing away the debris. It wasn't just a stone. Someone had carved into its surface. Crude, weathered letters, filled with lichen, but unmistakable, S and E, Sarah and Elias. He traced the letters with a trembling finger, the rough edges catching on his skin. They'd carved it together a lifetime ago, teenagers declaring their bond to the wilderness and each other. He'd forgotten, completely, buried it under years of work, routine, and then finally under grief. He looked up. Ember stood beside him, her head lowered, her soft muzzle gently blowing warm air onto the carved stone. Her large, dark eye met his. In that quiet clearing, under the benevolent arms of the old tree, with the scent of sun-warmed earth and horse surrounding him, Elias understood. It wasn't just about saving the orphan Sarah had watched. It wasn't just about fulfilling a promise. Ember hadn't just led him to a forgotten carving. She had led him back to Sarah's heart, back to the wild, hopeful love that had defined them before time and loss took its toll, back to the place where S and E wasn't a memorial, but a testament to something enduring. The responsibility Sarah left behind wasn't just a horse, it was a compass. Ember, this wild, scarred creature, had carried him through his own desolation and led him back to the source. Not to erase the pain, but to remember the love that existed before it. He wasn't just giving Ember a home. She was giving him back a piece of himself he thought was lost forever. The piece Sarah had always seen, even when he couldn't. He rested his forehead against the cool, rough bark of the ancient apple tree, Ember's warm breath steady on his neck. High above, a single, perfect blossom, impossibly late, clung to a high branch, a fragile white star against the endless blue. A quiet peace, profound and hard-won, settled over him, as deep and real as the roots of the tree beneath his feet. Healing wasn't the absence of scars, he realized. It was learning to carry them, guided by unexpected lights in the wilderness of the heart. Sometimes the ones who carry you home are the ones you found lost in the wild. If this story found its way into your heart, if Ember's quiet courage and Elias's journey resonated with a place inside you, don't let it end here. Hit subscribe so you never miss the next story that might just mend a piece of your own world. Leave a comment below. Tell us what moved you, what lingered. Share this moment with someone who needs it. And tap that bell icon, because tomorrow, another soul might whisper their truth, waiting to be heard. Be here for it.